Cornfields. They stretch for miles, their towering stalks swaying gently in the wind, whispering secrets only the brave dare to listen to. They're a symbol of rural life, simple and serene. But once the sun dips below the horizon, the fields transform into an endless labyrinth of shadows and eerie sounds, hiding truths that are anything but ordinary. Tonight, we're delving into three true stories that unfold within these hauntingly quiet fields. Each one is a chilling reminder that not all horrors come from our imaginations. Some are disturbingly real. Picture this. You're driving down a lonely rural road, the only light coming from the thin beam of your headlights. On either side, endless rows of corn stand like silent sentinels, their rustling almost drowned out by the hum of your engine. It's peaceful, but there's something about the stillness that feels off. You can't quite put your finger on it, but an inexplicable weight settles in your chest. You roll up the window, convincing yourself it's just the isolation playing tricks on your mind. But then your car jerks unexpectedly, and the engine, cutting through the thick darkness like a fragile thread. On either side of the road, towering cornfields seem to stretch endlessly, their edges blurred into the night. It's quiet, unnaturally so, with only the occasional hum of insects to remind you that life exists here at all. Your hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Maybe it's the isolation, or maybe it's the way the stalks seem to lean in just a bit too close to the road. Either way, an unease creeps up your spine. That's exactly how Megan felt when she found herself driving home late one evening after visiting her parents. She had taken this route hundreds of times before, long stretches of empty road flanked by cornfields on either side. But tonight was different. The radio had cut out miles ago, and her phone, though resting in the passenger seat, had no service. The only thing accompanying her was the rhythmic crunch of her tires against the gravel road and the occasional rustle of wind through the fields. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Then it happened. A shadow darted across the road ahead of her. It was so quick that Megan almost thought she'd imagined it. But her gut told her otherwise. Slamming on the brakes, she squinted into the darkness, her headlights illuminating nothing but an empty stretch of road. Her heart pounded as she scanned the cornfields on either side, their edges blending into a wall of blackness. Probably a deer, she whispered to herself, though the words didn't ease her nerves. She wanted to keep driving, but her curiosity, or maybe something deeper, kept her rooted in place. She rolled her window down, letting the cool night air spill into the car. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding small and uncertain against the vast emptiness. No response, just the wind and the rustle of corn. Megan hesitated, then shook her head. She wasn't about to get out of her car for a shadow. Putting her foot on the gas, she continued down the road, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Miles away, in another small town surrounded by endless cornfields, Daniel and his younger brother, Max, were busy trying to finish up their evening chores. Their family farm was old, the kind of place that seemed to have stories seeping from its wooden beams. Most of them were harmless, tales passed down from their grandparents about peculiar sounds in the fields or strange lights seen late at night. But one story always stuck with Daniel. It was about the scarecrow. Their grandfather had made it decades ago, stuffing old clothes with straw and fashioning a face out of burlap. It had stood watch over the fields for years, its weathered features staring blankly into the distance. But as the story went, one night, their grandfather swore he saw it move. Just a slight turn of the head, a shift of the shoulders. Everyone laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But Daniel always found himself glancing at the scarecrow whenever he was out in the fields, half expecting it to look back. That evening, as he and Max loaded bales of hay into the barn, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It was a feeling he had before, like eyes were on him, watching from just beyond the edge of the light. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand. But then Max froze, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Max pointed toward the cornfields, where the stalks swayed gently in the breeze. At first, Daniel saw nothing, just the endless rows of corn, their golden leaves catching the faint glow of the moon. But then a figure emerged, a dark silhouette standing just at the edge of the field. It wasn't moving, just standing there, almost as if it were waiting. "Who's out there?" Daniel called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just there. "We should go inside," Max whispered, tugging on Daniel's sleeve. For once, Daniel didn't argue. Grabbing the flashlight from the barn, he kept it trained on the edge of the field as they backed toward the house. But by the time they reached the porch and turned back, the figure was gone. Meanwhile, across the state, another story was unfolding. Ellie, a college student home for the summer, had taken up jogging to clear her mind. She loved the quiet of the countryside, the way the fields seemed to go on forever. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of her dorm. But one evening, as she jogged along a familiar path cutting through the cornfields, something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, thick with the scent of earth and something faintly metallic. The birds that normally chirped in the distance were silent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. Ellie slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the field beside her. At first, it looked normal, just rows of corn stretching into the horizon. But then she noticed it. One of the stalks was broken, bent at an odd angle. Then another and another, forming a path that disappeared deeper into the field. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The rational part of her brain told her to keep going, to head home and forget about it. But curiosity got the better of her. Stepping off the path, she followed the trail, the corn brushing against her arms as she pushed deeper into the field. The further she went, the darker it became, the towering stalks blocking out the last remnants of daylight. She was about to turn back when she heard it, a faint rustling sound, too deliberate to be the wind. "Hello," she called, her voice shaky. The rustling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a low whisper, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. She spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but corn. Taking a shaky step back, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, landing hard on the ground. Looking down, she saw what had tripped her, a shoe, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't hers, and it didn't look like it had been there long. Ellie's chest tightened as she scrambled to her feet, suddenly very aware of how far she was from the safety of the road. She didn't wait to hear another whisper. She ran, pushing her way through the corn until she burst back onto the path, her lungs burning and her mind racing. As Ellie ran home, her thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion. She didn't know what she had stumbled upon, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going back into those fields anytime soon. What she didn't know was that her discovery was only the beginning. Megan's hands trembled slightly on the wheel as she drove, the eerie silence of the road weighing heavily on her. The shadow she'd seen moments ago lingered in her mind, replaying over and over, refusing to let her focus on the road ahead. She stole a glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following her. But there was nothing, just the dark ribbon of the road stretching behind her and the endless cornfields on either side. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. She slowed as she approached an intersection marked by a weathered wooden sign. The road to her left would take her home, but to her right was a detour, a route she rarely took, but one she knew would loop back toward town. On impulse, she turned right, convincing herself it was to calm her nerves. If she could prove to herself that nothing strange was going on, she might finally be able to shake the unease that clung to her. The road was narrower here, with the cornfields pressing closer to the edges. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows deeper. As her car crept along, her headlights caught something glinting in the road ahead. She slowed to a stop, squinting to make it out. It was a scarecrow. Or at least it looked like one. It was propped awkwardly against a wooden post at the edge of the cornfield, its head tilted to one side as if studying her. Megan hesitated, the engine idling as she debated what to do. The scarecrow hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. This was a road she'd driven many times, and she would have remembered something so strange. Against her better judgment, she rolled down her window, leaning out to get a better look. The figure was crude, its clothes patched and torn, its straw-filled arms dangling limply at its sides. But it was the face that unsettled her most. Instead of the usual burlap sack, it had a mask, blank and featureless, with 2 dark holes where the eyes should have been. Megan's headlights barely cut through the heavy fog that had suddenly rolled in, swallowing the road ahead. The air was thick now, damp and cold, pressing in on her as she tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The scarecrow was still in her mind, its blank mask etched into her memory like a photograph. She could almost feel its hollow eyes on her, as if it was still standing just behind her car, watching. Her instincts screamed at her to get home, lock the doors and forget about tonight, but something deeper kept her moving forward, a mix of fear and the gnawing need for answers. The fog thickened, and her speed slowed to a crawl. Then, without warning, her car shuddered. The engine sputtered, and the lights flickered before everything went dark. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine. She sat frozen, gripping the wheel as though it might keep her safe. The fog pressed closer, clinging to the car like a living thing. And then she heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps in the gravel behind her. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned to look out the back window, but the thick fog revealed nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence stretched unbearably. Then, the faint tap of something against the driver's side window made her jump. She forced herself to look, her heart hammering so loudly she could barely think. At first, there was nothing, just the fog swirling like smoke against the glass. But then, faintly, she saw it, the outline of a hand, pressed against the outside of the window. Back at the farm, Daniel couldn't shake the image of the scarecrow's tilted head. He'd gone back inside, bolting every door and window, but the unease wouldn't leave him. He sat in the kitchen, the house dark and silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Max was upstairs, likely asleep, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to rest. His flashlight sat on the table, its beam flickering faintly before finally giving out. Suddenly, there was a noise outside, a soft, steady scraping sound, like something dragging along the side of the house. He froze, his ears straining to make sense of it. Slowly, he rose from the table, every step toward the window feeling heavier than the last. Pulling back the curtain, he peered out into the yard. The barn loomed in the distance, its doors slightly ajar, though he was sure he'd locked them earlier. The cornfield beyond seemed to ripple, though there was no wind. The scraping stopped, and Daniel's pulse quickened. He was about to turn away when he saw it, movement near the edge of the field. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as it emerged from the shadows, he realized it was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. It paused near the barn, its head snapping up to look directly at the house. Daniel stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding. He grabbed his phone, dialing his parents, but the call wouldn't go through. No service, he muttered, panic rising in his chest. A loud thud sounded from the back door, and he nearly dropped the phone. The thud came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, he crept toward the door, a kitchen knife clenched in his hand. When he reached it, he braced himself, then yanked it open, only to find nothing but an empty porch and the faint rustle of the cornfield in the distance. Ellie wasn't sleeping either. She'd barricaded her bedroom door with a chair, her eyes darting between the window and the shadows creeping across the walls. Her heart still raced from the sight of the figure outside, and though it was gone now, the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. Every creak of the old house made her jump, her imagination filling in the gaps with things she didn't want to picture. Then came the sound. It started faintly, like whispers carried on the wind, but grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just outside, it was coming from the cornfield. She crept to the window, peering out cautiously. The rows of corn swayed unnaturally, their movements too deliberate to be the wind. And then she saw it again, closer this time, the same figure, standing at the edge of the yard, its head tilted in a way that seemed almost curious. She backed away, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. She had to call someone, anyone, but her fingers trembled too much to dial. The whispers grew louder, almost as if they were coming from inside the room now. She spun around, her back pressed to the wall as her eyes darted to every shadow, every corner. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it felt suffocating. The car began to clear, revealing a shadowed figure standing a few feet away, just beyond the beam of her flashlight. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. She gripped the flashlight tighter, her mind racing as she weighed her options. Run, stay in the car, try to start the engine again. Before she could decide, the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Then another and another, until it was close enough for her to see the faint outline of its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was nothing but a blank, featureless mask staring back at her. In that moment, Megan, Daniel, and Ellie were each caught in the same breathless tension, their lives converging in ways they couldn't yet understand. Whatever had been lurking in the shadows was no longer content to stay hidden. It was coming for them, drawing closer with every passing second, and none of them were ready for what came next. Megan couldn't breathe. The featureless mask, pale in the dim glow of her flashlight, felt like it was boring into her, despite having no eyes. She was frozen in place, every nerve in her body screaming for her to move, but she couldn't. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand, its fingers curling unnaturally as it pointed toward the cornfield. Megan's gaze followed the gesture, but the dense rows revealed nothing but darkness. When she looked back, the figure was gone, as if it had melted into the fog. Her heart raced as she fumbled to restart the car. The engine sputtered, the sound echoing like a death knell in the oppressive silence. She tried again, her foot slamming the pedal, and finally, the car rolled to life. Without looking back, she threw it into drive and sped down the narrow road, the cornfield blurring into a wall of shadows on either side. But the sense of relief didn't come. Her chest was tight, her mind replaying what she'd seen, and what it had pointed to. Something was out there, something waiting in the corn. Daniel was pacing his living room, the knife still clutched tightly in his hand. The barn doors were wide open now, swaying slightly in the breeze. He hadn't opened them. He was sure of it. Every logical part of his mind told him to stay inside, to call for help, even if his phone wouldn't work. But something deeper, something almost primal, drew him toward the barn. It felt like he had no choice, like whatever was out there wanted him to come. And somehow, it knew he would. As he stepped outside, the night seemed to thicken around him. The air was heavy, pressing against his skin like a damp blanket. He moved cautiously toward the barn, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. When he reached the doors, he paused, his pulse pounding in his ears. Inside, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the weak glow of his flashlight. He hesitated, then stepped forward, the beam illuminating the dusty floorboards and the shadowy shapes of tools hanging from the walls. Something moved in the corner, just at the edge of his vision. He swung the flashlight around, but it only caught empty space. His grip tightened on the knife as he took another step. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound steady. There was no answer, just the faint creak of wood settling. But then, from deeper within the barn, came a sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, wheezing breath. Ellie sat frozen on her bed, the voice outside her door still ringing in her ears. Her name, spoken so deliberately, felt like it was coming from someone who knew her intimately, someone who wanted her to believe they were safe. But she knew better. She could feel the malice behind the words, the sharp edge hidden beneath the soft tone. The chair against the door rattled again, and she pressed herself further into the corner of the room, her phone clutched in her hands. The whispers started up again, louder this time, like a swarm of voices all speaking at once. It was coming from the hallway, from the cornfield, from everywhere. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The window was too high, the door blocked. She was trapped. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from somewhere outside, came a sound that made her blood run cold, a high-pitched, inhuman wail, rising and falling like the cry of something that shouldn't exist. It was coming from the cornfield, and it was getting closer. Daniel arrived home with Max shortly after, his own pulse echoing the same unnatural rhythm. They sat in the living room, the lights on and every door locked, but no amount of security could make them feel safe. Daniel wanted to reassure his younger brother, to tell him that everything would be okay, but he couldn't find the words. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you protect someone from something you don't even understand? Ellie's return home was no less fraught. She bolted the door behind her and collapsed on the couch, her breathing ragged. Her chest felt heavy, the pulse an unrelenting reminder of what had happened. She tried to push it out of her mind, to convince herself that it was over, but deep down she knew better. Whatever had been in that field, whatever had chosen them, wasn't finished. The days that followed were eerily quiet. The town seemed unchanged, its residents going about their lives as if nothing had happened. But for Megan, Daniel, and Ellie, everything was different. Each of them felt a growing unease, a sense that they were being watched. The pulse in their chests became a constant presence, subtle but impossible to ignore. They avoided the cornfield, but its shadow loomed over them, a silent reminder of the night they couldn't forget. Megan spent hours researching, combing through articles and forums, desperate for answers. She found stories, whispers of similar events in isolated places, tales of people disappearing or coming back. Different. But there were no clear explanations, no solutions. Every lead ended in speculation, and the more she read, the more her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to something far larger than themselves, something beyond human understanding. Daniel took a different approach. He tried to pretend it hadn't happened, throwing himself into his routines and focusing on caring for Max. But the pulse was always there, a constant reminder that he couldn't escape. At night, he'd sit by the window, staring out at the cornfield, half expecting to see the figures again. He never did, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before a storm. Ellie withdrew from her friends and family, the experience isolating her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She tried to reach out to Megan and Daniel, hoping they might have some answers, but the conversations always ended in uncertainty. They were all grappling with the same questions. Why had they been chosen? What had really happened in that field? And most importantly, what would come next? A week later, the pulse began to change. It grew stronger, more insistent, as if calling them back to the field. Megan tried to resist it, ignoring the pull as long as she could, but it became unbearable. She didn't want to go, didn't want to face whatever was waiting, but the compulsion was overwhelming. She wasn't surprised when she found Daniel and Ellie already there, standing at the edge of the cornfield, their faces pale but resolute. None of them spoke as they entered the field. The corn seemed taller now, the rows narrower, the air thicker. The pulse in their chests synchronized with each step, guiding them toward the center. When they reached the clearing, it was empty. No light, no figures, no structure, just bare earth and a crushing sense of anticipation. Megan broke the silence. Why are we here? Her voice wavered, but it was the question they'd all been too afraid to ask. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. Ellie stared at the ground, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. The pulse surged suddenly, sending a wave of energy through them that brought them to their knees. The earth beneath them began to tremble, and the air filled with that same low hum they'd heard before. The clearing lit up, a faint glow radiating from the ground itself. The light coalesced into shapes, forming a pattern, a symbol none of them recognized but somehow understood. It was a message, though not in words. It was a feeling, a knowledge imparted directly into their minds. Asterisk, you are the messengers, asterisk. The words weren't spoken but imprinted in their consciousness, undeniable and absolute. Images flashed through their minds, visions of a world changed, of people awakening to something greater, of a connection that spanned beyond the boundaries of Earth. The pulse was not a threat but a gift, a bridge to something beyond human comprehension. As quickly as it started, the light faded, and the pulse receded into silence. The clearing was dark again, the hum gone. Megan, Daniel, and Ellie sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd experienced pressing down on them. They didn't speak as they left the field, each of them lost in their thoughts. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it took a single staggering step toward him, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Behind it, the barn doors creaked as the wind, or something else, pushed them open wider. From the field beyond came the same low hum Megan had heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the barn. The creature stopped, its head snapping toward the sound before it began to retreat, its movements as strange as ever. Daniel didn't wait to see what it would do next. He grabbed the flashlight and bolted, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he ran toward the house. Ellie's scream caught in her throat as the figure in her room stepped closer, its silhouette sharper now in the faint light. She pressed herself against the wall, her body shaking as it reached out a long, thin hand. But just as its fingers brushed the edge of her blanket, it stopped. The hum reached her then, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to come from every direction. The figure froze, its head tilting sharply toward the window as if it, too, was hearing the call. Without looking back, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ellie trembling and alone. The hum grew louder, its pull undeniable. One by one, the strange figures, whatever they were, converged on the field, their movements mechanical, almost reverent. Megan watched from the road, unable to look away as the stalks parted for them, the corn bending as though bowing to some unseen force. From her position, she could see a faint light glowing deep within the field, its color shifting between shades of blue and green. It pulsed rhythmically, in time with the hum, like a heartbeat. Daniel burst into the house, slamming the door behind him. He ran to the kitchen, grabbing Max, who had come downstairs, groggy and confused. "We have to go," Daniel said, his voice urgent. "Now." Max started to argue, but then he heard it, the hum, the vibration. It was growing stronger, rattling the windows and filling the air with a strange pressure that made it hard to breathe. Megan stepped out of her car, the light from the field drawing her like a moth to a flame. She didn't want to go, didn't want to see what was waiting there, but her legs moved on their own. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though it was no longer entirely solid. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to shimmer, distorting the rows of corn around her. She wasn't alone. Figures emerged from all directions, each one drawn to the light as she was. Ellie stood at her window, the hum vibrating through her body. She could see the light now, faint but growing stronger, and she knew, whatever this was, it wasn't over. She grabbed her phone and tried to call Daniel, but the screen flickered and died, just as it had before. She didn't know what else to do, so she ran. Out the door, down the stairs, and into the night, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the light. All three of them, Megan, Daniel, and Ellie, reached the center of the field at nearly the same time, their paths converging without explanation. The pulsing light was blinding now, the hum almost deafening. In the center of the clearing was a strange structure, tall and spindly, like the skeletal frame of a tower. It glowed faintly, its surface shifting and alive. Around it stood the figures, their blank faces turned upward as though worshipping the light. And then the light shifted. It grew brighter, enveloping the clearing in a wave of energy that knocked them to their knees. The figures turned toward them in unison, their heads tilting as if acknowledging their presence for the first time. From the tower came a voice, not spoken, but felt, resonating deep in their bones. Asterisk, you have been chosen. Asterisk. The words weren't a statement, but a declaration, final and absolute. The light swelled again, and for a moment, everything was blindingly white. When the light faded, the figures were gone. The structure, the hum, the strange energy, it had all disappeared, leaving nothing but the swaying corn. Megan, Daniel, and Ellie sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just experienced pressing down on them. But as they stumbled back to their homes, each of them felt the same thing, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a second heartbeat, deep in their chests. Whatever had happened in that field wasn't over. It had left something behind, something waiting to awaken. Megan stumbled back to her car, her legs trembling and her mind racing. The cornfield was silent now, unnaturally still, as if nothing had ever happened. She reached the car and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. Her hands instinctively went to her chest, where she could still feel the faint, steady pulse beneath her skin. It wasn't her heartbeat. It was something else, something alien, and it terrified her. Daniel arrived home with Max shortly after, his own pulse echoing the same unnatural rhythm. They sat in the living room, the lights on and every door locked, but no amount of security could make them feel safe. Daniel wanted to reassure his younger brother, to tell him that everything would be okay, but he couldn't find the words. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you protect someone from something you don't even understand? Ellie's return home was no less fraught. She bolted the door behind her and collapsed on the couch, her breathing ragged. Her chest felt heavy, the pulse an unrelenting reminder of what had happened. She tried to push it out of her mind, to convince herself that it was over, but deep down she knew better. Whatever had been in that field, whatever had chosen them, wasn't finished. The days that followed were eerily quiet. The town seemed unchanged, its residents going about their lives as if nothing had happened. But for Megan, Daniel, and Ellie, everything was different. Each of them felt a growing unease, a sense that they were being watched. The pulse in their chests became a constant presence, subtle but impossible to ignore. They avoided the cornfield, but its shadow loomed over them, a silent reminder of the night they couldn't forget. Megan spent hours researching, combing through articles and forums, desperate for answers. She found stories, whispers of similar events in isolated places, tales of people disappearing or coming back. Different. But there were no clear explanations, no solutions. Every lead ended in speculation, and the more she read, the more her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to something far larger than themselves, something beyond human understanding. Daniel took a different approach. He tried to pretend it hadn't happened, throwing himself into his routines and focusing on caring for Max. But the pulse was always there, a constant reminder that he couldn't escape. At night, he'd sit by the window, staring out at the cornfield, half expecting to see the figures again. He never did, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before a storm. Ellie withdrew from her friends and family, the experience isolating her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She tried to reach out to Megan and Daniel, hoping they might have some answers, but the conversations always ended in uncertainty. They were all grappling with the same questions. Why had they been chosen? What had really happened in that field? And most importantly, what would come next? A week later, the pulse began to change. It grew stronger, more insistent, as if calling them back to the field. Megan tried to resist it, ignoring the pull as long as she could, but it became unbearable. She didn't want to go, didn't want to face whatever was waiting, but the compulsion was overwhelming. She wasn't surprised when she found Daniel and Ellie already there, standing at the edge of the cornfield, their faces pale but resolute. None of them spoke as they entered the field. The corn seemed taller now, the rows narrower, the air thicker. The pulse in their chests synchronized with each step, guiding them toward the center. When they reached the clearing, it was empty. No light, no figures, no structure, just bare earth and a crushing sense of anticipation. Megan broke the silence. "Why are we here?" Her voice wavered, but it was the question they'd all been too afraid to ask. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. Ellie stared at the ground, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. The pulse surged suddenly, sending a wave of energy through them that brought them to their knees. The earth beneath them began to tremble, and the air filled with that same low hum they'd heard before. The clearing lit up, a faint glow radiating from the ground itself. The light coalesced into shapes, forming a pattern, a symbol none of them recognized but somehow understood. It was a message, though not in words. It was a feeling, a knowledge imparted directly into their minds. Asterisk, you are the messengers, asterisk. The words weren't spoken but imprinted in their consciousness, undeniable and absolute. Images flashed through their minds, visions of a world changed, of people awakening to something greater, of a connection that spanned beyond the boundaries of Earth. The pulse was not a threat but a gift, a bridge to something beyond human comprehension. As quickly as it started, the light faded, and the pulse receded into silence. The clearing was dark again, the hum gone. Megan, Daniel, and Ellie sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they'd experienced pressing down on them. They didn't speak as they left the field, each of them lost in their thoughts. In the days that followed, the pulse didn't return. The heaviness in their chests was gone, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew it wasn't something they could share. Who would believe them? How could they explain the inexplicable? Megan stopped researching, the need for answers replaced by a quiet acceptance. Daniel found solace in his routines again, his nights by the window no longer filled with dread. Ellie reconnected with her friends, the isolation lifting as she embraced the normalcy she'd missed. But none of them forgot. The experience had changed them, leaving an indelible mark that would stay with them forever. Sometimes in the quiet moments, they would feel it, a faint echo of the pulse, a reminder of the night they were chosen. It wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a connection, a tether to something they could never fully understand, but would always carry with them. The cornfield stood silent, its secrets buried in the rows of swaying stalks. Whatever had come for them, whatever had left its mark, was gone. But the memory remained, a story that would never truly end.